A single spark can light a fire for liberty. Events surrounding a 19th century escaped slave in Boston provided that kind of spark. Anthony Burns was a Virginia slave owned by a man named Charles Suttle. In 1853, Burns escaped by ship to Boston, but his freedom was short-lived because Suttle soon came to reclaim his so-called property. Burns was arrested and held in the local courthouse. A crowd of abolitionists quickly gathered outside, and the numbers grew to about 2,000 people. A small number, led by a minister named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, charged the courthouse and managed to breach a wall. During the melee, a federal marshal was stabbed to death, but despite these aggressive efforts, Burns remained in custody. Determined to see the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 enforced, President Pierce ordered federal soldiers to assist the guards watching over Burns, who was ultimately ordered back to Virginia by a federal judge. More than 50,000 people lined the streets of Boston to watch and protest as Burns was escorted to a ship for his return to Virginia. Federal troops had to hold back waves upon waves of protesters. But things weren't over after Burns was transported south. Even though they lost this round in the short run, it took holding Boston in an effective state of martial law and fueled an even greater resistance to the federal pro-slavery law. The events generated strong opposition to Pierce and his administration across the North. Massachusetts residents formed an anti-manhunting league. William Lloyd Garrison burned copies of the Fugitive Slave Act, and as a result of the efforts of the Vigilance Committee to lobby the legislature and governor against him, Edward G. Loring, the judge who tried Burns, was removed from office in 1857. In a broader sense, the Burns case fueled anti-slavery sentiments all across the North. One man, Amos Adams Lawrence, described his feelings about the whole situation as he thrust himself into the abolitionist movement. He said, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists." Today, as the government ramps up its attacks on the Constitution and your liberty, it's normal to feel down or overwhelmed. But as the Burns saga shows, sooner or later they'll go too far, turning a spark into a firestorm for liberty. In the 18th century, Congressman Matthew Lyon went to jail for saying supposedly illegal words. But that didn't stop him from winning re-election, even while behind bars. The story of Matthew Lyon is a real-life political thriller. Vermont voters elected him to Congress in 1797. He was a Democrat-Republican, the minority party at the time. With the Federalist Party firmly in control of all three branches of government, Congress passed the Sedition Act, and President John Adams signed it in 1798. The act essentially outlawed criticism of the federal government. Now, this presented quite a problem for Democrat Republicans. How could a minority party gain power if its members couldn't legally say anything bad about the opposition? Lyon was the first prominent person charged under the Sedition Act. He had started his own newspaper. It was called The Scourge of Aristocracy and Repository of Important Political Truth. He published an article critical of President John Adams, accusing him of, quote, unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. He also blasted the president for using religion to drum up war against France, writing that he could not support the executive, quote, when I shall see the sacred name of religion employed as a state engine to make mankind hate. Lyon's political enemies also convinced a Vermont paper to publish a letter he wrote before the Sedition Act was even passed. In it, he called the president bullying and the Senate responses stupid. Lyon contended the act violated the First Amendment, but he was convicted and sentenced to 4 months in jail, a $1,000 fine, and court costs. He served time in a 16 by 12-foot cell used for felons, counterfeiters, thieves, and runaway slaves. Judge William Patterson, an avid nationalist and supporter of the Federalist Party, lamented the fact that he couldn't impose a harsher sentence. Lyon won re-election while in jail by a landslide. And 2 years later, in a beautiful twist of irony, Lyon cast the deciding vote for Thomas Jefferson, when a tie in the Electoral College threw the 1800 election to the House. Jefferson's win meant the Sedition Act would no longer be enforced, and the third president made good on that promise by refusing to enforce the Sedition Act even before it was ever repealed. Nowhere in the Constitution is the federal government empowered to pass laws restricting guns. Even if the Second Amendment had never been written, the federal government would still have very little constitutional authority to regulate guns. Federal power is limited to the areas delegated to it in the Constitution. The only congressional power relating to weaponry is found in Article 1, Section 8. That involves arming the militia. And as far as the president goes, he doesn't have the authority to regulate anything. Even so, if the Second Amendment never existed, the federal government could only conceivably regulate firearms in the process of exercising another legitimate power. For example, if the Second Amendment didn't exist, Congress might be able to make the case for gun regulations in a law relating to interstate commerce. But the Second Amendment slams that door shut. It declares the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The meaning of the word infringe hasn't changed much since the Bill of Rights was ratified. It means to act so as to limit or undermine something, encroach on, violate. The Second Amendment supersedes any conceivable authority to regulate firearms you might be able to wring out of the Constitution's delegated powers. Simply put, the federal government may not constitutionally act in any way that limits the right to keep and bear arms, period. Charles Langston. You probably never heard his name, but I consider him a great hero of nullification and liberty. His story is next. On September 13, 1858, a federal marshal in Oberlin, Ohio, arrested a fugitive slave named John Price. Hoping to avoid resistance and the Underground Railroad, the marshal took Price to the nearby town of Wellington. But word spread, and a group of Oberlin residents went to that town and met up with others, determined to win Price's freedom. The marshal and his deputies took refuge in a hotel. The people tried to negotiate for Price's release, but when that failed, they stormed the hotel and found him in the attic. They ushered Price out of town and eventually brought him safely to freedom in Canada. But that doesn't end the story. A federal grand jury indicted 37 participants in the rescue under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In response, Ohio actually arrested the federal marshal and his deputies. That led to tense negotiations between Ohio and the federal government. The result? Unsurprisingly, the federal agents arrested by Ohio were released, but so were 35 of the 37 rescuers indicted and arrested by the feds. The remaining 2 were later found guilty but received relatively light sentences of just 20 and 60 days in jail. As in other northern states, a combination of action by the state and courage from individuals made possible this practical nullification of the hated Fugitive Slave Act. Charles Langston was one of the men convicted. He gave a speech before his sentencing, closing by saying, "I stand here to say that I will do all I can for any man thus seized and held, though the inevitable penalty of 6 months imprisonment and $1,000 fine for each offense hangs over me. We have a common humanity. You would do so, your manhood would require it, and no matter what the laws might be, you would honor yourself for doing it. Your friends would honor you for doing it. Your children to all generations would honor you for doing it. And every good and honest man would say, you had done right. Today, Mr. Langston, we honor you for doing right. Before making a decision on what to do about so-called sanctuary cities, it's important to first understand what they are and what they aren't. Some people are under the impression that a sanctuary city is a place where local government resources are being used to not only actively block federal immigration enforcement, but also to actively harbor and protect people who've violated federal immigration laws. But this couldn't be further from the truth. There is no city and no state in the country with such a policy. None. However, there are dozens of cities and 2 full states with policies that have been labeled as sanctuaries. And here's what they do. In most of the cities, there are expressly written policies or ordinances to ban local law enforcement from arresting people for violations of federal immigration law. This is similar to banning state tax agents from investigating people for violating the U.S. federal tax code. Because federal immigration law falls under federal jurisdiction, a number of these cities have banned local law enforcement from even inquiring about the immigration status of a person they encounter, or informing federal agents of the possible presence of illegal aliens living in their communities. Additionally, 2 states, that's California and Connecticut, have sanctuary city-style laws on the books statewide. Known as the Transparency and Responsibility Using State Tools, or Trust Act, these laws ban the states from cooperating with or participating in a very narrow area of federal immigration enforcement. Under these state laws, if a person is arrested in the state and is due to be released for whatever they were being held for, they will not be held in custody beyond that time, even if the Federal Department of Homeland Security asks the state to hold them longer for possible immigration violations, which is something that DHS commonly does. More specifically, Trust Acts are addressing secure communities, a federal program that allows the DHS to access fingerprints taken by local police, to screen detained individuals for immigration status, and to request that local law enforcement agencies hold people for the federal government if they're found to be undocumented. However, what that federal program does not do is provide federal agents to deal with violations of federal law. The federal government, like it does for many federal programs, tries to get states to handle federal enforcement for them, and even foot the bill for it too. State trust acts and sanctuary city policies expose a serious flaw in federal immigration enforcement tactics and show significant power held by the states over this and other federal programs. As Hans Hermann Hoppe noted in his famous Mises Institute speech titled "What Must Be Done," without local enforcement by compliant local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air. Do you want to end the Federal Reserve? There are 4 steps you can take right now to help make this happen without waiting for the federal government to shut down its own funding source. Step 1. Create state gold depositories. Texas took this step this year. When it opens, a person will be able to deposit gold or silver and then make or accept payments in precious metal. By making gold and silver available for regular daily transactions by the general public, gold depository laws have the potential for wide-reaching effect. If people in multiple states start doing this, it will create serious competition with Federal Reserve notes, an essential part of the people learning the true nature of fiat money. Step 2. Pass state constitutional tender acts. These laws require states to do something they haven't done in decades: follow Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. As part of the state law, the state would be required to use only gold and silver coins or their equivalents, such as checks or electronic transfers, for payments of any debt owed by or to the state, including taxes, fees, contract payments, and the like. Step 3. Buy gold and silver and use it. We can all do this, and as more people hold and use gold and silver, it will begin to replace Federal Reserve notes as a preferred medium of exchange due to its stability and its ability to retain value over time. Step 4. Use Bitcoin and other decentralized currencies. Individuals can also turn to alternative, decentralized currencies such as Bitcoin. It is not controlled or owned by anyone, and so it is not susceptible to manipulation or inflation by a central bank like the Fed. While none of these actions will nullify the Fed's monetary monopoly on their own, taking action on all these fronts will help undermine the Federal Reserve and put us on a path to ending the Fed, whether the federal government wants us to or not. Almost every time an expert is brought out to discuss nullification, they give this false story that it was used to protect slavery. History proves, without much digging, that the opposite was actually true. While the most commonly discussed nullification event is generally the standoff between South Carolina and President Jackson over the so-called Tariff of Abominations in the 1830s, it was actually northern states that used nullification most widely and successfully before the Civil War. Almost every northern state passed a personal liberty law that effectively nullified in practice the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Not only that, leading abolitionists expressly supported the principle of nullification. Take, for example, John Greenleaf Whittier, the ardent abolitionist poet from Massachusetts. In 1833, he published an anti-slavery pamphlet titled Justice and Expediency that included a call for immediate emancipation of all slaves, an extremely radical position at the time. From there, he dedicated the next 20 years of his life to the anti-slavery cause. Whittier flat out identified himself as a nullifier. He wrote, "Since the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law by Congress, I find myself in a position with respect to it, which I fear my fellow citizens generally are not prepared to justify. So far as that law is concerned, I am a nullifier." Or how about William Lloyd Garrison, editor of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator? He helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society and also called for the immediate emancipation of slaves. Garrison publicly supported Whittier in his advocacy of nullification. He wrote, "The nullification advocated by Mr. Whittier is loyalty to goodness." No matter how hard they try to smear it, nullification has some pretty serious moral firepower behind it. It becomes a lot harder to sell the principle as evil when you know one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society considered it goodness against federal slavery laws. everyone has the right to keep and bear arms, but it's totally wrong to refer to this as a constitutional right or your Second Amendment rights. The right to keep and bear arms is actually part of a broader, natural right to self-defense. No government, no document, no vote creates your right to self-defense. You have this right because you are a living, breathing human being. One of America's first constitutional scholars was St. George Tucker. In 1803, he called the right to self-defense the Palladium of liberty. He wrote, "The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible." Think about it. Guns are banned in England, but that doesn't mean Brits don't have a natural right to self-defense. They do, but their government violates that right every single day. And the people there are unfortunately letting them get away with it. This is where the Second Amendment comes in. People in the founding era understood that their new government would eventually do what all governments do: try to confine the people's right to self-defense within narrow limits. So they insisted on a restriction of power to keep the U.S. government from doing just that. The Second Amendment doesn't create a right to keep and bear arms. What it does is prohibit the federal government from violating the natural right you already have. And that prohibition is absolute. In the landmark 1842 case, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, Justice Joseph Story intended to expand federal power. Instead, he further cemented James Madison's strategy for states and individuals to bring down federal programs. Margaret Morgan was a former slave living in Pennsylvania after her owner set her free, but she was never officially released, and the slaver's widow later decided she wanted to reclaim her so-called property. Edward Prigg was the slave catcher who snatched Morgan and her child in Pennsylvania and took them back to Maryland. But in the process, he failed to follow the procedures set forth in Pennsylvania's personal liberty law. Pennsylvania authorities charged Prigg with kidnapping. In response, Prigg asserted the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 trumped Pennsylvania law, arguing the state had no authority to interfere with his federally endorsed slave catching. When the case reached the Supreme Court, Justice Story agreed with Prigg, in part. Story held that Congress had the sole authority to legislate in the matter of fugitive slave rendition, and state governments couldn't actively interfere in any way, not even to stop kidnapping. Ironically, though, Story's plan to further cement federal dominance actually backfired. He left an Easter egg in his opinion, which said that while states couldn't actively interfere with federal slave rendition, they also couldn't be forced to help the federal government either. He wrote, "The states cannot be compelled to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause, and it might well be deemed an unconstitutional exercise of the power of interpretation to insist that the states are bound to provide means to carry into effect the duties of the national government, nowhere delegated or entrusted to them by the Constitution." In the coming years, northern states seized on the case and used it strategically to nullify the next Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in practice. They did this primarily by actively refusing to cooperate with or provide resources to federal agents trying to enforce the hated Federal Act. This was the same strategy that James Madison advised back in 1788. Writing in Federalist Number 46, Madison recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union as a way to limit federal power and bring down federal programs. While the Supreme Court has often gotten things wrong on the Constitution, Joseph Story's opinion in Prigg versus Pennsylvania has never been overturned. In fact, it has been reaffirmed by the court in a number of cases spanning more than 150 years. This has helped cement James Madison's advice as a legitimate and essential part of the constitutional system. While much of the Constitution is easy to comprehend and read, it is a 19th century legal document and often needs some research to understand what was originally ratified. But the founders did leave us instructions on where to start. If you wanted to understand Macbeth and you had a choice between asking your friend, listening to a lecture by some English teacher, or reading a book about the play by Shakespeare himself, which would you choose? You'd choose the book by the man who wrote the play, right? You'd go to the source. So where do you go to figure out the original meaning of the Constitution? Well, the source, the people who gave it legal force. James Madison put it like this in a letter to Henry Lee. I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. And if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers. Today, you have all kinds of original sources just a mouse click away. You can read the ratification debates. You have the Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution. You have essays written by opponents. With just a little effort, you can get a very clear understanding of the Constitution right from the source. This is exactly how Thomas Jefferson told us to do it as well. He said, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or intended against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." You might be tempted to think that there is no way to nullify without a legislative body repealing a law or a judge striking it down, but this certainly isn't always the case. One of the most absurd examples of a nullified law comes from Virginia, where the state completely bans sex except between married couples. No matter your age or your partner's, breaking this law is supposed to get you slapped with a Class 4 misdemeanor. In February 2014, an effort to repeal this law failed. However, there is no doubt that while the law is not legally null and void, it is nullified in practice on a daily basis. Unmarried couples still have sex in Virginia, and the police do not engage in bedroom or backseat raids to enforce the law. From 1920 to 1933, there was a nationwide ban on the sale, production, importation, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. That ban didn't work. Prohibition didn't fail because a federal judge struck it down, and it was being ended well before a constitutional amendment repealed it. Prohibition was reduced to a virtually unenforceable decree in much of the country for many reasons, including mass individual disregard of the law, along with a refusal by states to assist the federal government in its enforcement. Most commentators today focus solely on nullification as a process in the legal realm and completely ignore its practical definition, indicating they must believe a lot more people in Virginia have misdemeanor convictions on their records than actually do. These people become so focused on the law in the strict sense of the word that their narrow vision prevents them from seeing the bigger picture. That's why we define nullification like this: any act or set of acts which has as its result a particular law being rendered null and void or unenforceable in practice. Some nullification supporters believe that states can only respond to federal acts deemed unconstitutional, but the father of the Constitution disagreed. Refusal to cooperate with or participate in federal programs is a powerful tool for states to stop the federal government. The feds depend on state resources and personnel for virtually everything they do. When states refuse to participate, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the federal government to run its programs or enforce its laws. That's what we call nullification in practice. But a lot of people who support this kind of action want to put limits on just how far a state can go. They'll tell you that states can't just go around blocking federal actions they don't happen to like. They insist that a federal act needs to be declared unconstitutional before a state refuses to participate. But James Madison didn't see it that way at all. In Federalist number 46, he specifically advised disobedience along with a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union as a way to end unconstitutional or constitutional but unpopular federal acts. In fact, he considered this an essential part of the checks and balances of the system, which includes more than just the federal branches, but also the states and the people too. We often find all three federal branches supporting programs that go beyond their original constitutional authority. It's easy to justify resisting or opting out of those programs. But just because something is constitutional doesn't make it good policy. So when the feds make bad choices, even if constitutionally authorized, individuals and states still have recourse beyond voting the bums out, or just hoping that one federal branch will stop another. James Madison was pretty straightforward. When the federal government does something it shouldn't do, whether unconstitutional or just bad policy, you should refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Doing so in large numbers is an extremely effective method to bring down federal programs, whether the federal government agrees with us or not. Most people today will tell you that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. But a living, breathing Constitution is really a dead one. The Constitution is essentially a contract, and you can't have a living, breathing contract that evolves to fit the needs of some or even all the parties to the agreement over time. Think about it. Would you sign a living, breathing mortgage? Of course not, because you would have no idea what it really means. Contractual provisions have a fixed meaning. When you sign on the dotted line, you expect them to remain constant over time. When there is a disagreement, both parties argue their position based on how they understood the contract when they signed it. Nobody would accept the other side or their banker saying, "Well, I know the mortgage meant so-and-so, but now it means something different. It's a living, breathing mortgage." That's absurd, and a living, breathing Constitution is no less absurd. The rule of law requires consistency. Otherwise, government becomes arbitrary. That's exactly what we have today. The federal government makes up things as it goes along. They claim the power to tell you what kind of light bulb you can use, what kind of plant you can grow in your own backyard, or how much they can tax you for doing absolutely nothing. This is all based on a living, breathing lie. Last Saturday, 6 new nullification laws went into effect, taking on unconstitutional federal programs like surveillance, prohibition, and medical restrictions. Laws taking on the surveillance state went into effect in 2 states on Saturday. In Minnesota, SF 86 puts strict limitations on the use of automated license plate readers, or ALPRs, to track your location through pictures of your license plate. The federal government has been operating a nationwide license plate tracking program for over 8 years by relying on states to operate ALPRs and share the data. But the new law bans Minnesota from participating in this kind of program. In North Dakota, House Bill 1328 requires a warrant before deploying a drone for surveillance purposes with only a few exceptions. The new law also acts as a roadblock to some federal programs. Much of the funding for drones at the state and local level comes from the federal government, in and of itself a constitutional violation. In return, federal agencies tap into the information gathered by state and local law enforcement. Restricting drone use on a local level limits the amount of information the feds can actually tap into. Also in North Dakota, House Bill 1436 went into effect as law on Saturday. It authorizes the commercial farming, production, and sale of industrial hemp in the state, all of which are prohibited by the federal government. Additionally, the text of the new law expressly rejects any need for federal permission for hemp farming. And in 3 states, Alabama, Minnesota, and North Dakota, new right-to-try laws went into effect on Saturday as well, allowing terminally ill patients access to some experimental treatments not approved by the FDA. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act prohibits general access to experimental drugs without a lengthy approval process that some people die waiting for. These new state laws bypass the FDA and allow patients to obtain experimental drugs from manufacturers without first getting federal approval, an essential step towards nullifying these federal restrictions in practice. Each of these 6 nullification laws chip away at unconstitutional federal overreach, but they are far from alone. Stay tuned for the 10th Amendment Center's State of the Nullification Movement report for 2015, coming in September, where we detail the expansion of the movement throughout the country. Modern politicians and legal experts seem to think that necessary and proper means anything and everything, but they couldn't be more wrong. Supporters of the monster state use the necessary and proper clause found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to justify all kinds of federal activities that the Constitution actually doesn't authorize. They like to refer to this clause as the elastic clause because of how they stretch it, pull it, and wrap it around all kinds of new power never intended by the founders. Even Central Power-loving Alexander Hamilton said the necessary and proper clause did not give the federal government any additional powers. He called the clause a truism in Federalist Number 33, saying the operation of government would be precisely the same if it were obliterated. So what exactly does necessary and proper mean? Basically, it allows an agent to do things not explicitly spelled out in a legal document, but necessary to carry out delegated powers. The founders considered these incidental powers and recognized 3 criteria for constitutionality. 1. An incidental power must be necessary to carry out the delegated power, like buying land on which to establish a post office. 2. It must be a customary way of carrying out the delegated power, like hiring people to deliver the mail. And 3, it must never rise to a level greater than the original power delegated, like claiming the power to own all truck manufacturers under the power to establish a post office and post roads. Or take this as another example. Say I contract you to run my grocery store. I don't need to spell out that you can pay a guy to clean the floors or hire a mechanic to fix a freezer. Those powers are necessary and customary to running a grocery store. But you wouldn't have the legal authority to buy a farm or use revenue from the store to subsidize the growth of one product, like corn, to the detriment of others. Necessary and proper authorizes the federal government to do ordinary things in carrying out the powers delegated to it in the Constitution. It does not authorize the government to take over, control, or monopolize anything and everything. One of the most prominent examples of nullification in the 19th century had everything to do with slavery, but it was people opposing slavery that used this tool to protect liberty, and not the other way around. Jerry is what everyone called him. His birth name was William Henry. He was a 40-year-old escaped slave from Missouri. He was living in Syracuse, New York for 8 years before he was arrested in 1851 under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. But Syracuse was an abolitionist hotspot. So popular was the city among anti-slavery forces that it was known as the Great Central Depot of the Underground Railroad. Earlier in 1851, the hated Secretary of State Daniel Webster had warned that the law would be enforced even here in Syracuse in the midst of the next anti-slavery convention. The arrest of Jerry was considered a message from the federal government that the locally unpopular law would be seriously enforced by federal agents. But abolitionists were not deterred by Webster's federal threat, and Jerry had a lot of local support. An immediate effort to free Jerry helped him escape to the street in irons, but he was quickly recaptured. He was then relocated to a more secure room, but a crowd of 2,500 people surrounded the building, and they overwhelmed them by numbers, not by blows. Jerry was brought to a safe house, and a few days later, he made his way to freedom in Canada. 26 people were put on trial for helping Jerry escape, but only one person was convicted. That's because they couldn't find a jury in the area willing to do anything but acquit. In the other direction, the rescuers were eventually able to get an indictment against Marshall Allen for kidnapping Jerry and use the occasion to argue against the constitutionality of the federal fugitive slave law. While Allen wasn't sent to prison either, the entire episode shows how Northern abolitionists used various tools from protests to the Underground Railroad, direct action, and various forms of nullification to block the practical effect of the pro-slavery Federal Act in Syracuse. Did you know that the federal government has a program to track your location through pictures of your license plate? It does, and it can be stopped without waiting for the federal government to stop itself. Earlier this year, the Wall Street Journal reported that the federal government, through the Drug Enforcement Agency, that's the DEA, has been tracking the location of millions of vehicles. They've engaged in this warrantless surveillance for nearly 8 years, all in secret, without any public notice of the policy. The tracking is done through automated license plate readers, or ALPRs, primarily operated by state and local law enforcement, and not the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security has given more than $50 million in federal grants since 2007 to law enforcement agencies around the country to buy ALPRs. Thousands of police departments across the country use these scanners today. In other words, this is a federal program being operated by the states. ALPRs, either affixed to stationary locations like telephone poles or mobile on the front and back of police patrol cars, can capture images of license plates at a rate of thousands per minute. An ALPR-equipped squad car parked outside the office of an anti-war organization or a gun club could suck up the plate data of everyone coming and going while the cop inside took a nap. A mobile system on a highway can record and transmit the plate data of every car that passes it, potentially hundreds of thousands of people per day. When the camera snaps a photo of each passing license plate, it also marks the GPS location and time and date of the interaction, storing a unique file for what is called a catch. As law enforcement captures this information locally, we now know they've been passing this location tracking data along to the DEA nationally. And it's our view that it's also likely being passed along to the FBI and other federal agencies through federal, state fusion centers. But since a majority of federal license plate tracking data comes from local law enforcement, states can effectively block this program by not handing over the information in the first place. Laws should be passed by states banning the use of ALPRs for surveillance without a warrant and prohibiting the sharing of data collected. The end result is quite simple. No data means no federal license plate tracking program. Some people complain when we focus on aggressive police-state tactics at a local level. Because the 10th Amendment leaves so many issues to the states, they say, these things should be of no concern to the 10th Amendment Center. But they miss two important facts. First of all, many of the worst local programs are either done in support of unconstitutional federal acts or regulations, or they're funded by unconstitutional federal grants. Take surveillance, for example. Stingray devices mimic cell phone towers. They trick all phones in a given area into connecting to it instead of the tower. Local police sweep up all the data and communications, and a lot of people rightly don't like it. But a look behind the curtain reveals that the feds are pulling the strings. The FBI generally hands these devices over to police, or they give them grant money to buy them. Then, if a Freedom of Information Act request is filed on their use, the local police are instructed by the FBI to kick such requests up to the feds, who generally ignore them. The same goes for automated license plate readers, which are operated in most every state of the country. The feds often give grant money to buy them, and 8 years after the fact, it was discovered that the DEA had been getting information from many local agencies to build a nationwide license plate tracking program. Millions of people have been electronically followed by the feds with the help of your local police for the crime of driving. In short, this kind of surveillance would not be happening if it weren't for the behind-the-scenes partnerships between federal and state governments. The same scenario plays out on enforcement of all kinds of other issues like environmental regulations, educational programs, gun control measures, drug prohibition, and more. More importantly, though, people who tell us to ignore local policies ignore the founders. The Constitution wasn't created to have a limited federal government and a bunch of local tyrannies. By keeping the most difficult and divisive issues close to home, the goal was to give liberty a chance to grow everywhere. People who accept, tolerate, or even promote local violations of liberty under the guise of states' rights undermine the founders' vision. Understanding the opposition has been essential for success, from ancient warriors like Sun Tzu to modern tacticians in sports and business. You don't normally win without knowing how your enemy operates and what they're capable of. When it comes to nullification, the establishment on both the left and the right are equally bad. The leadership in state houses around the country will stop at almost nothing to block good bills from moving forward. While each state is a moderately different process, the Missouri State House provides a great example of what people who want to advance liberty are up against. Here's how things generally work in the Missouri State House. For a bill to pass, it first needs to be debated in a committee. Then if the committee passes it, it generally goes to the House floor. Once debated and voted on twice, it goes to the state Senate if it gets passed both times. The Speaker of the Missouri House, however, has a great deal of power over this process. This year, he was able to single-handedly block almost all bills that dealt with federal power with one simple action, or inaction, that is. Missouri House rules require the Speaker to assign all bills to a committee, but no deadline is specified. So what's an establishment Republican to do with a bunch of good nullification bills? Simple. Absolutely nothing. This year, the Missouri Speaker held on to a number of them, dealing with issues like Obamacare, Common Core, and gun control, refusing to assign them to a committee until the last day of the legislative session. With this move, he personally prevented good bills from even reaching the first stage of the process, public debate in a committee. What committee the bill goes to is critical as well, and the few he did assign were sent to a committee where the chair was happy to hold the bills from getting a vote instead. While Missouri was particularly bad in this regard in 2015, Republican leaders in states like Texas, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Utah used these same strategic moves to quietly kill bills their base would have supported. Without more people understanding this process and paying attention to what bills are being filed in their state rather than in Washington, D.C., this will continue to happen no matter what political party is in power in your state. But thankfully, the number of nullification bills being filed each year is growing by leaps and bounds. Like any barrier, even these party stalwarts have cracks in their armor. The more you throw at them, the more likely you are to break through. What happens if your state passes a law saying that certain federal regulations are unconstitutional, and any federal agent attempting to enforce that law commits a felony crime? Well, in the case of Wyoming, absolutely nothing. Back in 2010, former Wyoming Governor Dave Freudenthal signed the Firearms Freedom Act into law, asserting that firearms made, sold, and kept only in Wyoming are exempt from federal gun laws and regulations under the Commerce Clause. Unlike similar bills passed in other states, the Wyoming law stated that any federal agent violating the state law could get up to $2,000 fines and up to a year in prison. Some people thought the law was a great move, and in my own report at the time, I even touted it as a line in the sand. But here's the rub. It's now 5 years later and not a thing has happened. There doesn't appear to be any additional firearms manufacturing happening under this law in Wyoming, and there aren't any moves by Wyoming law enforcement to stop federal agents from enforcing anything either. Compare that with another issue on something that's happening in Colorado right now. In 2012, voters there passed Amendment 64 to legalize marijuana and its cousin, industrial hemp. In the fall of 2013, farmers in southeastern Colorado began harvesting hemp crops. They did this even though federal law considers hemp illegal. But it's not just farmers. The crops need to be processed for use in consumer products. ABC7 in Denver reported that the first large-scale hemp processing plant began operations. ABC noted that hemp is still illegal under federal law, so processing facilities are hard to find, and most processing is done by hand. But Pure Vision technology is processing hemp on a large scale anyway. They're turning the stalks into pulp that can be used to make paper, or into sugar to make biofuels that can replace oil. If no farmers grew the plant and no businesses like Pure Vision took the risk to expand the market, Amendment 64 would have been meaningless for hemp. Instead, it's this 1-2 punch of state law and individual action that's resulting in a practical nullification of the federal prohibition on industrial hemp farming. While passing state bills is an essential part of any strategy to reject or nullify unconstitutional federal overreach, it's human action that's most important, because this is what puts these bills into practice. Media headlines are saying that the NSA is going to wind down its warrantless surveillance program unless the Patriot Act gets a last-minute renewal. Don't believe it. NSA spying will continue unabated whether the Patriot Act is renewed or not. The main point of contention under the Patriot Act is Section 215. The NSA claims it gives them authority to collect phone data, even though a federal judge recently held that the spy program isn't actually authorized by this section. More importantly, though, the NSA doesn't actually care what the law says. They want to spy on everyone in the world, and they're going to find a way to do it. According to former NSA chief analyst John Schindler, the agency has a platoon of lawyers to figure out how to stay within the law and maximize collection by exploiting every legal loophole. In other words, repeal one law, and they'll justify what they do under another legal argument. Take, for example, Executive Order 12333, signed by Ronald Reagan in 1981 and amended 3 times by George W. Bush between 2003 and 2008. Whistleblower Thomas Drake said it is now being used as the legal justification for spying. Under what's known as the program, no warrant or court approval is even needed, and the collection is never reported to Congress. On its face, 12333 authorized only foreign surveillance, but expressly allows what is called incidental domestic surveillance. Incidental is a legal term of art that the NSA interprets very widely. One whistleblower explained that it contains nothing to prevent the NSA from collecting and storing all communications, that's content as well as metadata, as long as it occurs outside the United States. But the nature of modern communications networks ensures that the NSA has a path to collect everything anyway. Whistleblower and former NSA Chief Technical Director William Binney put it this way: most collection of U.S. domestic communications and data is done under EO 12333. And while collecting all your electronic data and communication is bad enough, it's far from the only way the government is monitoring and following you. The FBI provides local police with stingrays. These are devices that mimic a cell phone tower and allow the cops to trick all phones in a given area into sending data to the device instead of to the tower. The DHS provides grant money for local police to buy drones, also used to spy on you. The DEA has been tracking the location of millions of Americans with automatic license plate readers, mostly operated by your local police. They've done it for 8 years now without any public notice or even any legal authorization. Trying to stop the surveillance state by repealing or overturning a federal law or order is like playing whack-a-mole. Stop one today, and they'll use another one tomorrow. And the DEA program shows they'll spy even if they can't find a legal excuse to back them up. While blocking renewal is important in theory, in practice, the only recourse is resistance. Some people want you to believe that the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution empowers the federal government to do virtually anything. This couldn't be further from the truth. Think about it. In Federalist number 45, James Madison said the powers of the federal government are few and defined. Logically speaking, a single clause can't possibly turn few and defined into whatever we want. In fact, Madison called this idea a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. The General Welfare Clause is found at the beginning of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It reads, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." This is followed by a list of specific powers, and that list raises a very difficult question for those people claiming it means Congress can do anything. If it does empower that, why even write the list in the first place? As Madison put it, nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. So what does this clause mean? It's really quite simple. The phrases general welfare and common defense simply mean that any tax collected must be spent to the benefit of the United States as a whole, not for regional or special interests. The federal government is to promote the general welfare and provide a common defense, but this is limited to the enumerated powers in the Constitution and must be done without favoritism.